Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Diversity in Lit Plotting Ahead 2021 panel. This is building on the very first diversity roundtable that Pearson hosted, where they launched their 10 aspirations for diversifying children's literature. So the point of today's webinar panel format is for you to hear from 4 people who are doing the work in schools, in the school system, on diversifying the curriculum and thinking about how we create belonging, create representation for all of those different diverse identities. So I'm your host, my name is Hannah Wilson. I'm a former head teacher and the co-founder and director of Diverse Educators. Let me invite the speakers to introduce themselves first of all. So Angie, can you tell everyone please who you are and what you do?
Hi everybody, I'm Angie Brown. I'm a former school leader and executive leader. I'm an English teacher originally, and I moved to Denmark about 2 years ago, at which point I started indulging in my passion, which is for diversity, equity, inclusion work. So I'm a DEI consultant and also a coach working with people who have or who hold protected characteristics and who come from previously minoritized groups and who are interested in breaking through into school leadership.
Thank you, Angie. Daniel, can you tell everyone who you are, please, and what you do?
Hello, I'm Daniel Tomlinson-Gray. I am co-founder and director of LGBTed, whose aim is to increase the visibility of authentic LGBT+ role models in schools. We're currently going from strength to strength, having recently recruited 2 new directors, which is very exciting. I'm also a full-time English teacher and media studies teacher too.
Fantastic, thank you, Daniel. And Jamie, you're in my good books. I'm not going to call you James. Jamie, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi there, my name is Jamie. I'm a developmental psychologist and I'm also an education officer at Nasen, the National Association of Special Educational Needs, where I lead on our CPDL programs.
Thank you, Jamie. And last but not least, Zahara, can you tell everyone please who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Zahara. I'm a diversity, equality and inclusion lead, previous head of English and associate senior leader. And I work across a couple of schools in DEI, leading it. And I also blog and podcast under schoolshouldbe.com.
Thank you very much, speakers. So we are very heavy in the English teaching kind of like domain, but we're thinking today not just about the English curriculum, thinking about how we can broaden all of the curriculum. So if you're sat here and you're not an English teacher, you're still very welcome. There'll be lots of golden threads you can pull away, and also thinking about the cross-phase approach to this work as well. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just really share their vision, their view, their perspective on why this work is important. Why is it important for us to broaden the curriculum? So Angie, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, sure. So I often talk about being somebody who does this work because I held a protected characteristic, and I say held because I think when I was at school, it was much keener to me that I was a Black girl in a school that was predominantly peopled by white British folk. And it wasn't always a comfortable experience navigating the curriculum. So many of the representations I had of myself as a Black woman in particular, as a Black girl in particular, were derived from texts, experiences, historical perspectives that were hugely negative and hugely one-dimensional, actually. And although I often felt as though I was at odds with the curriculum, I guess that feeling of being an outsider to the experiences that were often being portrayed through the curriculum were really quite interesting and quite shaping ones. So they at first aligned me to other people who probably felt quite excluded by what was being presented. But also they excluded me from my own experience, because there was very much this sort of sense of, this is what you people who look like you have experienced. Do you not feel that way? Oh, no, I don't feel that way. I feel a bit depressed by that, but I also have no way of locating myself. And I think that's a really unsafe position to put people in. I think it's a really unsafe position to put young people in. So I'm really interested in this work to the extent that it allows people to feel the safety of what their many identities might be, of how they might choose to identify in across many different protected characteristics or not. The curriculum ought to provide opportunities for people to kind of hang that, oh yeah, maybe there's a bit of that in me, or maybe I want to explore that. My curriculum experience didn't do that. And so now I'm joining the dots between, if we do this work well, can we create the conditions for better safety, for better well-being, for better overall health outcomes, mental health outcomes for young people? And my answer, I guess, at the moment, I'm still exploring, is probably yes. So that's kind of where I come at it from.
Thank you, Angie. Daniel, would you want to share your perspective on why this work's important, why we need to commit to broadening the curriculum? You need to.
Absolutely. I think as teachers, we're in a unique position. We're not really just here to teach a subject. If you think about it, what we're really doing is we're trying to create well-rounded young people, citizens, people who are ready to go out into the world and be good, kind people. So that has to impact on how we deliver and how we teach our curriculum. And when I was at school, starting to come to terms with my sexuality, I had nobody who I knew was gay, certainly no teachers. And any representations I saw on television were overly camp or silly representations, or they were vilified by people or subject to homophobia. And the statistics are shocking where they exist. And they prove and they demonstrate why we need to do this. For example, nearly half of all lesbian, gay and bisexual students are bullied at school, and 64% are trans students. Nearly half of LGBT+ students hear homophobic language regularly in their schools still. More than half of LGBT+ students feel that bullying has a negative impact on their education. These are the worst ones. 61% of LGBT+ young people have self-harmed, and 45% of young trans people have attempted to take their own life, and half of those have succeeded. And in schools, we are the people that these people see the most. We are in a really unique position to support and educate these young people, to make sure they don't feel the way that I felt when I was at school, and that when they go out into the world, they feel safe and they feel empowered.
So, Browne, thank you for showing that start data, because when we really sit and look at it, like there should be a real sense of responsibility from the whole system that this just isn't good enough. And I'm guessing that you were citing the Just Like Us report. Is that where the data came from, Daniel?
The data I was citing was from Stonewall report. The Just Like Us report is more recent, and the statistics in there are very similar.
Yeah, so please do have a look at those two reports and make sure your safeguarding lead in particular has seen them. Moving on to you, Jamie, what's your perspective on this idea of broadening the curriculum for all students?
So I think one of the things we're looking at from a sort of SEND context is just a recognition that the number of children and young people identified with a special educational need in the UK continues to rise. If the rate of increase over the past 5 years continues into the next 5 years, we'll be reaching a situation where between a fifth and a quarter of children and young people will have an identified special educational need. And so a special educational need requires special educational provision, which is defined as something different from or additional to that which is given to everybody else. So we're highlighting that a fifth or a quarter of our children and young people, the mainstream educational environments are an exclusionary space for them. It's somewhere that needs to be changed or adapted or accommodated to retroactively fit them in, which is not creating a kind of sense of belonging. It's not an inclusion by design that we've got going on there. And so what we're looking at in terms of kind of broadening the curriculum is that recognition that if we're designing for the average, we're designing for nobody. Whereas if we design for the margins, we're going to capture everybody within that. And it's about, therefore, reconceptualizing SEND, moving away from seeing it as this idea of a kind of difference or kind of deficit-focused narrative, to bring it back into the realms of the human universal, and just accommodating that understanding of inherent variability in all human beings.
I love that phrase, designing for the margins, like that intentionality around it being inclusive. Angie and I do a lot of work together. We talk about the fact that every school thinks they're inclusive, every leader thinks they're inclusive, every teacher would like to be inclusive. If we were as inclusive as we think we are, would we have the issues in society and in the system that we have? So we do need to hold the mirror up and really think about that.
And And I just think on that point, that word inclusion, I think has probably lost some of its kind of value. I think often inclusion, certainly from an SEN perspective, is seen as a geographical concept. So we're placing somebody somewhere. And I think it's better to think about it in terms of belonging. So to what extent is there a sense of belonging for these individuals? And that idea of differentiation, again, it's highlighting to me that when I originally designed this lesson, I wasn't thinking about you. I had to retrofit an accommodation for you.
Thank you, Jamie. Zahara, how about you? What's your perspective on this idea of broadening the curriculum?
I just think it's intrinsic to everything that goes on within a school and educating students for the outside. So when you think of behaviour management, they're like, as Jamie said, just to echo that sense of belonging, whereby the words equality and equity, I think, have also been slightly blurred and lost. And when I think about my own experiences, quite similar to what Angie was saying, and at school, in terms of English, studied canonical texts, loved English, and it wasn't until I got to university that I really started to explore multiculturalism across literature and looked at it from a sociological standpoint, a psychological standpoint, and I then had a real sense of belonging within English and the English classroom, I guess. And then I went on to work at a predominantly South Asian school, mainly students of an Asian background, and the students, and that's where I ended up on SLT, and I was the only woman under 30 on SLT with white men. And it was the students who said to me, "Oh, Miss, we've never seen anyone like you teach English or, be in that position." But the sense of confidence and belonging they felt at the school and within my classroom, because of representation and because of the empathetic discussions we were having and that relatable experience, I think is just intrinsic to student success and well-being. Like Angie was saying, that if we really want to work on student mental health and their management of things like social media, the cancel culture, call out culture, DEI is at the heart of it. And I think in terms of values of diversity and inclusion from a classroom standpoint, if we're talking about English especially, empathy is one of the greatest things that you can teach through literature. And I think DEI is looking at diverse text, whether that be non-fiction, fiction, looking at historians, looking at maths from a diverse perspective, for example. It can really help subliminally sometimes increase that sense of empathy for students, which then prepares them for the diverse workplace, the global context, which every student now is going to go into. So that's where that's what I try to do with schools, is get them to think about the bigger picture and then bring it back to their classroom to say, how do you make that sense of belonging relevant to your students, who will then fit into the wider global context in their future.
Brilliant, thank you, Zahara. And I'm just sat here and I want to just draw attention to the listeners to think about, like, even with this panel, what identities are being represented, what perspectives and lenses are we sharing? Because there's multiplicity here of identity in how people are sharing their own narratives. And if you are in a team that's not diverse and you are diversifying your curriculum, broadening your curriculum, how much lived experience is there around the table when you're making decisions about the curriculum intent and the diversification of texts in particular? So I've got a follow-up question for each of you, and I do want to encourage the listeners to pop some questions into the chat, because they'll come through to us, and we do want you to interact with the speakers as well. So Angie, let me come back to you first of all. You're the author of Lighting the Way, and in that book you focus on this case for ethical leadership. Can you articulate and summarise for the listeners the kind of the role that leaders have, and how this idea of broadening representation in subjects like English and beyond is actually part of that ethical responsibility of leadership?
Thanks, Hannah. That's a good question. So one of the reasons that I try to make a case for one of the ways I try to make a case for ethical leadership is by really focusing very clearly on what leadership might actually mean. So I think that's another term that gets bandied about quite loosely, and everybody likes to think that they are a leader and everybody wants to be a leader. my argument in the book is that we are in times, socially, politically, in a secular society, in a broadly secular society, in which there is a real absence of leadership. So this week in politics, you can just look at it and you can say, wow, what an absence, what a catastrophic absence of moral, ethical leadership. And as a consequence of that, plus diminishing resources, the lack of infrastructure to support people, young people and families, and people who are really on the margins, it falls to schools to do a lot of that. It falls to schools to be a place, a site of leadership, of genuine leadership, and that needs to be taken really seriously. So I feel as though school leaders need to say, not only am I stepping up to do this thing called leadership, but I take the full weight of responsibility for what that means for society beyond this, because nobody else is doing that job. And with that then comes a responsibility to really know and understand the context that we're working in. And I don't just mean the local context, I mean the context around the experiences for people who hold these protected characteristics. Protected for a reason, protected because in 2019-20, 110,000 people found themselves a victim of hate crimes. Protected because 3/4 of those hate crimes are still perpetrated against people on the grounds of their race, because over 8,000 hate crimes are committed against people because they hold a disability or describe themselves as having a disability. This is not a kind of loose, oh, I think I'll be a leader. For me, this is a really serious responsibility. And so for me, school leadership is the holding of that role in society that says I'm going to be the bit in my way, however large or small, that interrupts some of those things, and to see oneself as interrupting social patterns, to see oneself as interrupting cultures, to see oneself as interrupting and therefore leaving a legacy that's better for those 105,000 people who happen to report the crimes that were perpetrated against them is really critical. And I think it's I don't even know if it's difficult. I think it probably requires a level of reflexivity that we don't have very much around leadership, the opportunity to really sit and be with some of those issues that are out there. And it requires a level of autonomy, even in a system that suggests you don't have any, to take on some of this, to take on some of those messages, some of that dogma, some of that, well, that's just how we do things around there. And I think that piece around giving people the confidence to take that kind of action, that kind of brave action, that would mean that as leaders, we're all upstanders and not bystanders in the true sense, is a bit that is missing from any leadership development I've ever seen. I don't know where that module is on how you take action, on how you socially activate yourself. But that's kind of why I wrote the book, because I feel as though we're missing that piece around encouraging people that if they do step into this breach, then largely all they're trying to do is to say, I think I see a better direction and I want you to come with me. And that's enough. It doesn't have to be right. It doesn't always have to work out, but it's enough to say, let's just try it, because it could be better than what we're doing now.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. And you outlined the kind of the case for it in your book, but other things just to signpost the listeners too, like thinking about the Nolan principles and how the Nolan principles hold the public sector to account. Thinking about your school values. So Zahara talked about the school values. Like, are your school values about the children, or are they about your whole institution? And are the values holding all of the stakeholders in your school to account? And if you say that kindness and respect and empathy are your school values, how is that showing up in your behaviour contract for staff and students? How is that showing up in your curriculum? We need to triangulate all of this and kind of like consolidate it, make it coherent and cohesive. Daniel, just to spotlight your book. So did you edit or write the book, The Big Gay Adventures in Education? Do you just say about your book?
Yes, I forgot to bring a copy with me. It's at home, private place in my house, but I don't have one at work, sadly. Big Gay Adventures in Education. Yes, I am the editor of that book. There are 24 individual experiences that people share about what it means to be an out teacher or leader in schools. Some of those experiences are from former students as well, and what it meant to them to have a leader or a teacher in school who was out. And that's published through Routledge and it's available now.
Thank you, Daniel. So that was my bridge to the question for you about thinking about the progress we've made in recent years about becoming more inclusive of LGBTQI history, individuals, role models within the curriculum. Have we come far enough? What needs to be done for us to continue to make progress in this space?
We have made some progress. Some schools have made a lot more progress than others. And that's the problem. It's not consistent across the country in all schools for all children. And obviously now we're in the middle of a culture war, essentially. I feel that in some ways we're taking a few steps back and we're having to battle a lot more to get our voices heard. For example, the Equality and Diversity Fund, as we all know, has been axed, and organisations like LGBTed relied on that funding to do the work that we were doing to help empower LGBT plus school leaders in schools, to help diversify the curriculum in schools for LGBT plus students. All of that work, we now risk losing the momentum because we've taken a step back in terms of funding. And I will come to that a bit more, but I think overall what we're trying to ensure is happening in curriculums now more than ever, or haven't often been heard. And we're taking those different voices on board. That's what the book is about. It's about people sharing the voices that haven't often been heard, because there's so little data out there about what it means to be LGBT plus in school, or how many LGBT plus leaders there are, or the experience of LGBT plus people in school. We have to rely more and more on subjective individual experiences. And every writer in English has their own subjective experience, whether they're straight, whether they're gay, whether they're black, etc. They have their experiences. And why not include a range of those people and a range of those people's experiences in the curriculum that we teach? It's the best way, I think, to ensure that, that these voices are heard, is by weaving it into our curriculum wherever possible. And I don't mean in a tokenistic way. I don't mean celebratory months and Pride Day or Pride Week, etc. They're great. They're a good start. I'm not criticising those, or they are a good. It's very tokenistic, and what we need to be doing instead is actualising the experiences of LGBT plus people. I don't like the word normalising. I prefer the word usualising. I don't know who used that word first, but that's a great word too. But actually, we'll take it a step further and actually actualise the experience of LGBT plus people in schools. So, for example, across, I'll talk about a range of subjects here. So the work that we've been doing with different schools, David Lowbridge Ellis, who's part of our network, who is amazing. He's a deputy head teacher, and he put together a knowledge organiser, which links to as many subjects as possible that schools can dip in and out of, and ways of actualising LGBT plus experience. Let's say in English, for example. So you could mention that Carol Ann Duffy, the poet, is a lesbian, okay? That's fine, but it's also a little bit tokenistic. It's almost kind of out of context. What you could do instead to actualise her experiences is say something along the lines of, how are Duffy's poems in this collection applicable to different relationships? Or how do different relationships affect Caroline Duffy's views? And you have a chance there to talk about all different kinds of relationships. You're not just drawing attention to the fact that she happens to be a lesbian. Also, Sigrid Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, war poets, were gay. It's a perfect opportunity to talk about conflicting masculinity. The idea that they are fighting for their country, that they are at the same time not allowed to be themselves. They're fighting for a country that doesn't actually want them. How does that add a whole new angle to their work? How does Sassoon's own feelings about his conflicted masculinity reveal themselves in his work? And in maths, you could look at census reports about which percentage of population do not identify as heterosexual, for example. Or in a maths question, use two names of the same gender. Daniel and Samuel, my husband, pick up their daughter Katie from school at 3:30. It takes 25 minutes to get home. But on Friday, it takes them 40 minutes. What is their average journey time? Something like that, where you're just planting this little seed into people's heads, representing LGBTQ plus people wherever possible. And sadly, some of the barriers that we face, though, is not just funding, but also SLT themselves often don't see, in some schools, in fact, many schools don't see the value in this. They call themselves an inclusive school, but they're not an inclusive school. And you shouldn't call yourself an inclusive school if you're not. Is your curriculum inclusive? And as you've said, Hannah, is everything that you do as inclusive as possible? For some SLT don't see the value, for example, in CPD that focuses on LGBT plus issues. Some SLT will argue that the content's not age appropriate. Well, what's not age appropriate about talking about masculinity in Sassoon's poems, or, you know, or different types of family in PSHE? What's not age appropriate about that? I think historically there's been a link in a quite a homophobic way, of course. Historically, there's been a link between LGBT plus people and paedophilia and sex. Some people instantly will start thinking about the sex angle, and but you don't do that with straight representation. That doesn't happen with straight representation in the curriculum. So why would it happen with LGBT plus representation? So it's what I'm a roundabout way of trying to say here is we need to try to hear those voices that aren't being heard, and try to put those voices into our curriculum so that the LGBT plus people in our classrooms feel themselves and see themselves represented, because you can't be what you can't see. And we've got a long way to go to make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Daniel. I've popped the link to the toolkit you mentioned that David created in the chat, so please do access it and share that. And just two things I wanted to pick up. You talked about the word usualise. It's Dr. Sue Sanders, the founder of Schools Out and LGBT Month, who coined that phrase, but I do like your extension of it to be actualising, because normalising, when we use the word normalise, which lots of people use, we're suggesting that there's an abnormality about the marginalised group and there's a normality about the dominant group. So just that language reframe is really key. And I wanted to pick up on the data bit, Daniel, because quite often we haven't got the data about the diversity of our stakeholder groups. And like this year, it was the first time the national census asked a question about non-binary and trans identities. We didn't have that data before. The school census doesn't always ask all the questions to get the richness of the diversity data we need. So think about what data you have about your own school community. How well do you know the diversity of the students, the pupils you're actually teaching, to inform the diversification of the curriculum as well? So coming to you, Jamie.
One thing, sorry, I had one thing about the data, is that depending on which data set you read, the number of people who aren't straight is between 2% and 49%. And we don't know what number that's going to be. So when 18 to 24-year-olds were asked in a survey how they identify, 49% said they don't identify as completely straight, whatever that might be on the spectrum, which is actually a huge number. So when the census comes out, potentially we might be shocked by what we see, and therefore more work needs to be done more urgently.
Wow, thank you for adding that in. And just before October half term, it was International Day of the Pronoun, and there's now 57 different gender identities for us to think about as well. So the data is constantly changing as well. So following up with you, Jamie, like you do a lot of work nationally and internationally around SEND strategy in schools. And I'd like you just to kind of share a little bit more of your thinking about how we can avoid the exclusion of SEND voices in the classroom. You used a great phrase earlier on about exclusionary spaces. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for us, please? You need to pop on mute though so we can hear you.
I excluded myself from the space. I think, you know, I'm going to be picking up, I think, on a lot of themes that we've already spoken about. You know, talking about that tokenistic representation, and that we have kind of specific weeks where we can focus on specific groups. So there's obviously Disability Awareness Week, and it's really about trying to move away from the piecemeal adoption of these isolated interventions towards that idea of inclusion by design that I've spoken about before. And one of the things we need to look at is almost reconceptualizing our understanding of SEN, because what we've seen in the last few years is almost an accidental shift back to an old medical model of disability and difference that used to be the predominant model. So a greater focus on early identification of needs and a proliferation of CPDL focusing on the increasingly wide range of categories into which pupils with SEN are placed has no doubt contributed to that rise in the number of children and young people with SEN. And timely support for children and young people is vital, and increased recognition of need may well have been beneficial, but that unintended consequence of greater awareness of specific areas of difference is that reemergence of the medical model. And within that context, SEN are conceived of in terms of discrete diagnostic categories, so ADHD, dyslexia, autism. And too great a focus on these categorical definitions can lead to these difficulties becoming pathologized, becoming seen as psychologically abnormal. And therefore new barriers to support and inclusion may then arise as certain groups become increasingly situated outside of the norm. And teachers can also then feel less skilled to support such a group. And a normal school is no longer deemed able to meet these distinct, now special needs. And what we look to do is to highlight that any label within education requires critical interrogation, because it's not simply descriptive, but acts to often constitute and limit who those students are. So autistic pupils have a disorder. Those with ADHD have a deficit and a disorder, for example. And those labels, we have to remember, are a set of temporary constructs. And they not only serve to describe, but to define. And those definitions also generate norms around expectations and identities. So what constitutes a normal pupil? And that leads to that increasing number of pupils being situated outside of that normative construction of education. And rather than the validity of normal being questioned, the preponderance of labels can serve to reinforce the misconception there is a normal child, or there is a normal way of learning. And inherent variability becomes translated into these disorders or deficits. We're in a situation where a child or young person needs a label to justify their unique way of being. And implicit in the idea around SEN is that diagnoses explain something undesirable. And when the focus is on individual biological problems, labels can then also unintentionally serve to reinforce normalcy, or being normal as a legitimate concept. So you could argue, for example, that dyslexia necessitates an acceptance of normative assumptions of literacy. There's a normal way of learning to read or being able to read. But the normal child's a relatively modern creation. It's only been around for a kind of century, and yet it's rarely questioned. What we know is happening within academia, and particularly around mental health support, is a shift towards transdiagnostic approaches to understanding strengths and needs. So transdiagnostic, going across diagnoses, it's an over-engineered way of saying human, of looking at kind of what unites us. And these kind of approaches embrace complexities around interactive kind of biopsychosocial development. And in light of this, single diagnostic pathways focused on a binary divide between the normal and the different are recognized to be unstable. And we know there's increasing uncertainties around validity of diagnoses. There's inconsistent practice relating to diagnosis, and there's evidence that contextual factors such as socioeconomic status can strongly influence the likelihood of receiving a diagnosis, which calls the viability and utility of a differential diagnosis into question. And in the current educational context, where access to support is often predicated on a diagnosis, we have to really question whether it's ethically acceptable to sort students into these differently labeled boxes, particularly if the goal we're looking at is the advancement of equity for all. So what we look to do is to shift away from that focus on individual categories towards a more dimensional understanding of difference. So that transdiagnostic approach that concentrates on what unites us all, rather than trying to suppress our inherent diversity. And it recognizes the greater understanding and the points made earlier, empathy is to be found when we can kind of celebrate, embrace complexity by reiterating that notion where we draw the line between disordered and normal is ultimately, it's a political and social choice. It's not a scientific one. It's much contested in the scientific literature. And when you look at diagnostic manuals, you'll see over the years how they constantly change, highlighting that these aren't kind of reified labels. What's potentially helped is there is beginning to be a slight shift in our faith in the norm. So that proliferation of labels and the need for more and more children to receive multiple diagnoses to try to capture their unique profile is hopefully starting to make us realize that the wider we have to stretch these boxes to stuff these children into them, we start to question the utility of that box. And so as more and more young children are situated outside of it, normal hopefully starts to become the outlier. And so we can bring that difference back into the realm of human universal, re-empowering the teaching profession to be able to support all children and young people. And so rather than highlighting how certain groups differ, so send voices or these voices, it's recognizing we're all different, and support doesn't have to be better for any one group. It has to be better for everyone. And it's really kind of picking up on, there's a really lovely quote by Edgar Morin, who wrote a report for UNESCO on the future of education 22 years ago, and talking about what should be fundamental in the future of education is the idea of human unity shouldn't efface the fact of its diversity, and the idea of its diversity shouldn't efface the idea of its unity. And understanding what's human means understanding our unity and diversity, and our diversity and unity. And education should illustrate this unity diversity principle in all spheres. And our current situation of focusing on this piecemeal adoption of isolated interventions for different groups doesn't make that happen, whereas moving towards a universal design for learning, inclusion by design, gets us closer to that place, that recognition of inherent variability in all of our children and young people.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. There's so much I want to unpack there, but I think the key thing I really want the listeners to hear is about the power of language and how reductive language can be, and how the labels that we give people, like, do we refer to a person with a disability or disabled person, an autistic person, or a person with an autism? I think the language is such an important place to start. And there's lots of dialogue out there about the language around race and which words we should and shouldn't use and which acronyms we should and shouldn't use. But I think SEND in itself, the language of inclusion, is something for us to really think about how we talk about those individual human beings and how we label them and perhaps then reduce them or put them in a box. So thank you, Jamie. I'm just going to pop over, go on, do you want to add one thing?
Yeah, very quick. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's interrogating why do we need to translate these different ways of thinking into these different labels? Why can't we just accept them for being know people by their name rather than their diagnosis? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Jamie. So Zahara, like, with your experience in the field as a school leader, former head of department, now DEI leader, like, in your opinion, what are some of the barriers that you're witnessing, observing, that are perhaps not enabling schools to fully commit to the DEI strategy in their subjects? And what's your advice for navigating some of those obstacles and some of that adversity, perhaps?
Yeah, I'd say, like, there's a lot of noise in the sphere now, especially over the last 2 years, whereby social media has really sped up, and absolutely rightly so, our drive to change the curriculum, change the way we look at behaviour policies, change the way we look at parent-student interaction, teacher interaction with students within the classroom. And I think that level of speed isn't matched by the time teachers have, because you still have, because I know the audience is mainly English teachers, from a practical standpoint, you've got results to worry about, you've got exam classes, you've got assessment objectives, you've got parents' evenings coming out of your ears type thing. So with all of that in mind, and then you've got your own life. And so with all of that in mind, sometimes the time and the noise can feel very overwhelming, especially if your own journey in terms of academic education and curriculum has been not diverse, right? Like, I made the choice at university to spend pretty much 3 years focusing on diversity within literature globally, you know, looking at one point I was looking at Chinese, Jewish, American literature, and then South African women's writing, and then going to lectures with Tariq Modood. Like, it was just, but that was my choice, which then led me, when I started teaching, because that I had the time to decipher that noise, I could then put, on a practical level, schemes of work together on multicultural literature, on how do we talk about race in the classroom, how do we address Shylock in Merchant of Venice, how do we talk about Othello. They're core texts, but can we look at them from a more diverse lens? And that was over 10 years ago. And I would say the other thing that's quite scary in a way is this fear of language. The conversations about diversity, whether it be LGBT plus, SEND, neurodiversity, race, religion, they almost make people kind of freeze up. And in order to combat and overcome that barrier, I do think, kind of going back to what we've all been saying, school leaders have to prioritize it within their values and their ethos, and they almost need to take that CPD calendar, which is where, if we're talking about it from a practical standpoint for teachers, which is where time is allocated, and think, okay, do I need another teaching and learning CPD on marking, or can I have a teaching and learning CPD on diversifying this curriculum? Give my, a bit like what, like the questions that Daniel put forward about Wilfred Owen and Sassoon. Those are the sorts of questions that can really help teachers move forward in their lessons and in their teaching and in diversifying their own language. And I think recently, I know Twitter is a key place for education. However, I find Instagram amazing for DEI in education. There are so many useful bookstagrammers, people talking about ableism, that particular question that you just said, you know, do we refer to somebody with a disability? Do we refer to somebody as disabled? There are people sharing their lived experiences with research through infographics. There are also now so many books out there. So just to kind of name a few to just help some of the teachers on the call, you've got Black Joy, there's Blair Imani's new book, which I'll just show you, which is just here. And it's all about race, class, gender and disability. She's an American sort of influencer. There's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's, even if you're thinking about Key Stage 3, for example, and thinking about, again, that time that you need to put schemes of work and stuff together, I think it's just about changing our approach in terms of how we think of schemes of work, whereby when you think of texts like Pride and Prejudice or like Jane Eyre, for example, there is so much critical stuff out there, isn't there? Like, just like there, I think there is now for like a book like Noughts and Crosses, which has been around, I think it came out when I was in year 9, I think it came out. There isn't as much practical resources for teachers to use on the ground, which I know, I'm not saying that's an excuse for teachers, but equally it really does help if you can go to a seminar or, you know, have those resources available. So I think in order to cut through the noise now and to move forward, there now needs to be more practical sharing of resources and more collaboration between schools. You know, I'm happy to help, like use like Diverse Ed. I've learned so much through Diverse Ed, through the blogs. They're free to read. Creating that time, creating that space for teachers to diversify their knowledge, create those schemes of work on the ground, and then also let students take the lead. You know, students aren't that scared of social media. They need to be taught perhaps nuance and how to manage cancel culture and call out culture and the binaries, but they know a lot. And so let them center their experience, whether it be, so for example, if we look at like recent news of what happened at the school in Oldham about students praying in a classroom and then, you know, being told to come out, the issues with students protesting around Israel and Palestine, there is so much, and I wrote a blog piece for Diverse Ed based on that. There is so much literature and value that you can gain from your students to support schemes of work. And I think that's the basic groundwork that needs to be done in several schools first. But in order for that to happen, school leaders, from a pastoral standpoint and from a curriculum standpoint, have to create the space, the time, and the ethos whereby their teachers don't feel like it's tokenistic or an add-on. A bit like how Hannah, your conference on Diverse Ed was during the school day. Like you've got to sort of they've got to make it out that this, and believe, really, I guess it comes down to a mindset that this is intrinsic to my students' success, to their mental health, to their sense of belonging, to their career, university choices, and beyond, really.
Thank you, Zahara. And what the phrase that Jamie used earlier on about critical interrogation, and your references there to some of the criticality around books. I saw a tweet this morning that I thought was quite interesting, that quite a lot of schools in the English curriculum use Mark Haddon's Curious Incidents of the Dog at Nighttime as their book around SEND representation, but actually he didn't do any research into the experience of an Aspergeric child and didn't have lived experience to write that book. So that we're using that book as a kind of a holding up the kind of a representation, but actually, is it the best text choice for us to be using? I can't see any questions in the chat from the listeners. Please do populate them if you'd like me to ask any questions to the listeners. Otherwise, to the speakers, sorry. Otherwise, I've got a few follow-ups, because I think one of the big things for me is that we've got busy teachers eating their sandwich in the staff room, listening to us now. They want to do the work, and there are lots of barriers. Angie, can I come to you about some of the practical starting points? You do a lot of work helping schools with their DEI strategy. Like, if the overwhelm setting in, we're all knackered, what might some of the listeners do in January to get them started on the journey of really, truly diversifying their curriculum?
So one of the things I always find quite interesting is that most of us don't ever look at our policies on any of this work. So we kind of get busy doing the thing, but we don't necessarily get busy understanding what the school's commitment as it's set out has been. I've been doing quite a lot of work recently with just defining our terms. So what do we mean by diversifying? Even people have got really different ideas about that. What do we mean by decolonizing? What do we mean by disableism? What do we mean by, what does homophobia mean, and how is it understood in our school? How does it manifest itself? And what do we then do to interrupt any of those things? Because I feel like we start all this work way down the line when we don't actually understand what it is we're trying to engage in and why. So, and I think all of us have talked about language and the importance of understanding what it is we're even talking about. So I think some practical things to do, particularly for people who have sort of joined schools and are doing this work but haven't necessarily gone right back to the origin story, is to go back to the origin story and to look at and try to connect up. In fact, Hannah and I were doing this today. What are the vision and values of the school? How does it explain itself? And how is that mirrored or matched in the equality and diversity policy? How is that equality and diversity policy talking to the teaching and learning policy? What does the teaching and learning policy say to the curriculum policy? How is it understood through your behaviour policy? And I know that sounds boring, but I feel like policies are where we interrupt all of this, and our policies are not for us. They're for people out there who also want to feel like they're supported by an organisation and that they can make sense of it. I also think that often when you go back to your policies, you find that the school has said it has ambitions, as Daniel, I think you were saying, it's saying it's doing things that it isn't actually doing. Well, in many ways, that's power to your elbow, because in many ways, that's the opportunity to say, look, we set out to do these brilliant things and we're not actually enacting them. So how about, and then to put some ideas, to bring some ideas to life, to bring something to the table that could be the expression of how our ambitions could be met in practical terms in the classroom. I think the other thing is, back to the point you were making about the curious incident, Hannah, is that we also tend to do a lot of this work without actually asking anybody what they want. And the last thing anyone really needs is a kind of another well-meaning version of something that has also been concocted in our heads about what some group might want. And this was my experience as a child at school, and sort of continues to be my experience as people try to put in place an offering for me as a Black human being in the world that they've never asked me if I wanted that thing. So I think actually starting, like going right back to the beginning, what are our terms? What do people want? What are people's experience of being here? What is the child's experience of being in any of these classrooms like? And what would they say about what the changes ought to be? And just kind of disavow ourselves of any notion that we know what's best for a while. That's what I would do in January. And I'd probably do that from January to March, and then maybe start thinking about putting some things in action after that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really pertinent point that I know we've probably all witnessed this, that there's a lot of sincere intent and people committing to this work, But if we haven't got diversity in the gatekeeping group, the group who decide the resources, they decide which orders are going to sign off for the new books, if that's a group of straight, white, able-bodied people, then we haven't got that critical interrogation through the lines of accountability. So thinking about how we can diversify our own networks and diversify who's around the table making those decisions is absolutely vital. We've got a question in the chat from Amy. I'm going to ask this as a quick fire question to all four of you. Any guidance or recommendations for texts for English literature around fiction and poetry that you're teaching or you'd like to be teaching, just to glean some ideas here? And perhaps going back to Daniel's point about age appropriateness, you might want to say which year group perhaps you'd recommend teaching it with. So Daniel, are there a couple of recommendations from what you're teaching or what you'd like to be teaching? And can you unmute yourself so we can hear you?
Smooth, seamless. Yeah, what we teach here and what I've seen do really well, we've had to rename it. I mean, there used to be a unit of work called Poetry from Other Cultures. Now, the title I already find very, very patronising. So that's not an inclusive title. So we've renamed it Poetry of Identity. And actually, that unit of work from the Old English Anthology, there's a lot of really good poems in there from a variety of cultures that students have found really enjoyable and really interesting. So I'd always recommend that. There's also a book called Now is the Time for Running, which is a fantastic story about a young boy who is kicked out of Zimbabwe during the time of apartheid and finds comfort in football. So it's, if you want to be stereotypical and talk about what boys like, then not only does it tackle the experience of people of colour, but also it appeals to boys as readers too. So that's a really interesting text. They're the two that I can think of off the top of my head. I hope that helps. For secondary school.
That's great, Daniel, thank you. Jamie, going back to my point about curious of incidents, like which books would you recommend as texts for the classroom that are either by people with disabilities or have positive representation and protagonists, and then not being sort of like sidelined perhaps within the text?
Yeah, so the link that you posted up there, the Disability in Kidlit, is I'll probably outsource to there. So there they've got lists of books, so fiction texts that they try as much as they can to get texts written by people with disabilities. But if they're not written by people with disabilities, all of the reviews are carried out by people with disabilities. So if it's a book with an autistic protagonist, they have an autistic reviewer who will then unpick and say whether or not they feel it's an authentic representation and talk about that there. So rather than me saying what might be a good representation of an individual with a disability, that's a really great place to start. I mean, unfortunately, it hasn't been updated since sort of 2018. I think, unfortunately, they ran out of funding, but there's still further links and signposting to other sites that they've still got going, but there's still the back catalogue of all of those texts that have been reviewed. And that's moving, you know, all the way from sort of 11 up to kind of late adolescence texts there that are great for kind of stimulating discussions. You know, even if it's going for those ones that haven't been well reviewed, it's then you can unpick that and unpack that and looking at those. So, you know, with the Curious Incident Dog in the Nighttime, talking about the fact that you've got just that preponderance of either superhero or supervillain narratives around disability that are just not helpful. Again, even the superhero narratives are kind of not useful in terms of just highlighting it's just normal experience and questioning what's the narrative value that the author's seen in putting this individual with a disability in here, and is it one-dimensional? Are they just here because of this?
Great signposting, Jamie, thank you. And I was going to pop into the chat the name of a magazine that should be on your radar, Conscious Being. A lot of us will know Elizabeth Wright. She's an Australian Paralympic swimmer, and she's the editor of a magazine by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities. And it's an amazing and regular publication. If you're sat here listening and you're able-bodied and you've got no lived experience of disability, then perhaps that's a good place to start actually upskilling your own understanding of some of those identities, to then think about how you then disrupt your own dominant kind of like lens when you're choosing these texts as well. How about you, Zahara? What would you like to recommend?
Yeah, I was just getting that lit because I've just been talking to the English department about it. So there's a few. There's one that's new called Gender Swapped Fairy Tales, written by a husband and wife who's basically gone through all of the fairy tales and they've swapped the genders of the male and female characters, and it's excellent because you could almost use it at Key Stage 3, but then also as a critical text at A-level. There's another one called Girl Louding Voice, a little bit like Americana, and kind of going back to what you and Angie were saying about things being triggering and uncomfortable. It's okay to look at those things in the classroom, I think, and I think we need to just sort of, if we can look at texts like, or we did, like of Mice and Men, which have normalized certain terms, then we need to start looking at these texts which cause elements of discomfort. There's a kind of spark, which is about an autistic girl's campaign to establish a memorial for the women who lost their life. I won't read out there, but it's a good book. It's called A Kind of Spark. The Deep Blue by Aisha. I can put these out somehow
in the chat, or do a blog maybe, and then
yeah,
we can send the blog out.
Yeah, and then also in terms of for your Key Stage 3 book lists, books that I would recommend for teens, and they are going back a few years, kind of when I was at uni, were Caught in the Crossfire by Alan Gibbons, which is all about Islamophobia and post 9/11 and the relationship between I think it is a Muslim female and a white male, I think, if I remember correctly. Then Bali Rai, like, he's a great teenage writer who looks at mixed race relationships, as well as the feeling of being just an outsider in his and like arranged marriages and things like that. And then obviously like noughts and crosses is always a good starting point. So I think, and with those texts, there are already questions and sort of not schemes, but perhaps lesson ideas that teachers can start to use, whether that be as starters or like as whole schemes of work.
Brilliant, thank you, Zahara. And your reference there to the gender inversion of the fairy tales makes me think about the work the RSC are doing. Like, they're doing amazing work around disrupting the representation. I went to see the Taming of the Shrew with the gender inversion for my birthday. It was amazing just to see, and also very, very inclusive representation. They had people with disabilities as part of the cast, and the whole set was designed around that. So thinking about your drama text, I think, is key as well. Same question to you, Angie. Any signposting of particular books you think that Amy and others should be ordering?
Well, I haven't been teaching in the classroom for about 100 years, so I don't want to. I actually find it a bit patronising when people who haven't been teaching start talking about what they would like to teach. But I would reference things that I did like to teach for the reason Zahara, you just talked about. So, and you know, Daniel, we were talking about Carol Ann Duffy. For me, The World's Wife was always a really key text in kind of rewriting fairy tale, rewriting mythology, and really foregrounding the roles, different roles, making children think differently. So I always did The World's Wife with Year 7 and invited them to think about retellings themselves, because again, we can empower children a lot more to retell and to reshape and articulate hidden voices more than we can with the presentation of things sometimes. And on that note, I would say that most of when I was in the classroom, I was mainly teaching A-level. I would teach Carol Ann Duffy all the way up into sixth form, but alongside voices who have been deliberately suppressed and hidden. So particularly thinking about intersectional identities and how those intersectional identities often kind of Black or minority, racialized minorities and queer identities have been hidden figures often. And so there have been some key authors, Alice Walker is of course one of those, who have tried to unearth some of those hidden figures. Really, the question there for me is about who holds the power around what's published, who explores which voices are valid, who decides, who are the gatekeepers. And so for me, more than the text is the interesting conversation about the power in terms of how that gets circulated and how that's been suppressed over time by different people. So yeah, those are always my recommendations.
Awesome, thank you. And there's more going in the chat there from Zahara. And if you are on Twitter, follow our friend and colleague Benny Carver, who tweets out a DEI book every day. She's committed to doing it for 365 days. And each month she spotlights a different identity. So you've then got 30 books unpacking religion, or 30 books unpacking gender identities. So you all need to answer the following question in one short sentence, because we've only got literally a minute and a bit left. What is your key takeaway for the listeners about how they might go about diversifying their curriculum? In one quick tip takeaway, let me come to you, Angie, first. What's your one recommendation?
Ask young people and people who hold minoritized identities what they would like to see.
Thank you, Angie. Daniel? Unmute so we can hear you, babe.
I agree with Angela. Listen to what people want from you. Look at every aspect of your curriculum and check that it's not all dead straight white men.
Thank you. Jamie, what's your tip?
Just reiterate the same, one of the fundamental principles of universal design for learning is that you optimize relevance, value, and authenticity. So, what does it mean for these children in this classroom right now, and how do I make it as relevant and authentic and as valuable for them as possible?
Thank you, Jamie. And Zahara?
I'm going to steal one from Aisha Thomas, which I heard, which she said, what story is your curriculum telling? And just don't be afraid of the discomfort and the unfamiliarity.
So thank you very much to our 4 listeners. We appreciate your time at the end of a busy long term. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. We appreciate that you're juggling lots. And we also appreciate that this is just another thing sometimes to feel like to add to your work list. Think about how you integrate it. Think about how you might moderate and stagger the work and not try to overwhelm yourself or your team, but do think about your networks, diversify your networks. There's lots of great best practice out there. There's loads of opportunities to collaborate and we can go further, quicker together. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful Christmas break when it gets here. And we look forward to the conversations continuing into 2022.